Hey everybody, this video is called Go Get 'em, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Judges, where we're going to look at Gideon pursuing after Midian. So, Judges chapter 8, verse 1 through 3 starts out, "Now the men of Ephraim said to him, 'Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?' And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you?' Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that." So, as the last chapter ended, Ephraim joined the fight when Gideon called out to them. Yet, we see that they're upset with Gideon that he didn't call them before the battle had started. And Gideon's initial call for help went out to the tribes of Manasseh, his own tribe, and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, back in the 6th chapter, verse 35. And the men of Ephraim, they cared more about recognition than the overall good of Israel. And Ephraim is going to go nowhere. We're going to see, as we move into the next few chapters, we're going to see them being selfish as they are here. And Gideon didn't challenge their pride. He recognized or soothed by complimenting them and giving them the recognition that they craved. And more importantly, he challenged them to get involved in the work of God at hand. And his reply was a wise way to deal with the contention that they brought and when there's work for the Lord to be done. In verse 4 through 9 says, "When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Sukkoth, 'Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted. And I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian.' And the leaders of Sukkoth said, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?' So Gideon said, 'For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into his hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars.' Then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Sukkoth had answered." In verse 9, "So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, 'When I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower.'" So here we see tired men who fought hard, and they pursued the enemy over long distance. And the city of Sukkoth was called to support those who had fought in battle. And instead of help, the people of Sukkoth and Penuel had an excuse. They didn't want to support Israel in the fight against Midian until the battle was actually won. And even without the help of Sukkoth and Penuel, Gideon knew that he would win the battle through the Lord God. But yet we see that he's vowing to take revenge on those cities that refused to help the army of Israel at a very strategic time. And Gideon had them dragged under heavy weights over thorns and briars, which painfully tore their bodies. And this was a cruel torture to which ancient captives were often subjected to. And he did it on his return, not wanting to delay the pursuit, as we'll see in the upcoming verse 16. And they probably had defiantly boasted of their strength and their defensibility because of the tower. And he kept his promise, and more, as you'll see in verse 17. In verse 10 through 12 it says, "Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their armies were with them, about 15,000, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in the tents of the east of Nobah and Jogbeha, and then he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. So Gideon led another courageous surprise attack, and this wasn't the same as the 300 attacking men back in verse 12, but it was still a small army against a much rather larger army. And Gideon fought persistently until the battle was won, and he went after the leaders of the opposition. In verse 13 through 17 it says, Then Gideon the son of Joash returned from battle from the ascent of Heres, and he caught a young man in the men of Succoth and interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. And when he came to the men of Succoth and said, Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you have ridiculed me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men? And he took the elders of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So Gideon would punish them as he had already promised publicly, whipping them. And the leaders of the city of Succoth, he would whip them, and he would bring them through the thorns and the briars as a method to bring public humiliation and rebuke upon them. In verse 18 through 21 says, And he said to Zebah and the Zalmunna, What kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? So they answered, As you are, so they were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Then he said, They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not have killed you. And he said to Zethar, his firstborn, Rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, Rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on the camel necks. So apparently the two Midianite kings were responsible for the death of Gideon's brothers, and Gideon wanted this known, and he confessed before he executed the kings. And Zebah and Zalmunna knew that they deserved death, and they even went on here to encourage the executioner to carry out the death penalty. And Gideon desired to place a great honor on his son by killing the enemies of Israel and of God. And the earlier Midianite scourge inflicted on Israel was the worst. So this victory lived long in their minds. And in the book of Psalm 83 verse 11, Asaph spoke on this as well. And so verse 22-23, Then the men of Israel came to Gideon, Rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So the Israelites, they sinned by the misguided motive and the request that Gideon reign as king. And to his credit, the leader declined, insisted that God rules alone, that they don't need a king. And the desire for a human king over Israel started early in their history, and we're going to see it's going to come out to be a bad thing for them hundreds of years later in the days of Samuel, before God gives them the king that they asked for. And we'll see in the rest of the chapter, his actions are different than his words. In verse 24 through 26 it says, Then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings of his plunder, for they had golden earrings, because they were the Ishmaelites. So they answered, We will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes, which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. So, one thing that you must realize as we study the Old Testament here is the Ishmaelites are the same as the Midianites. And this was a sad way to end Gideon's influence as an expresses pride. And Gideon, he sought to lift himself up here in the eyes of the people. And Gideon intended no thing more than to make a breastplate, as David did later in 1 Chronicles 15:27, to indicate civil, not priestly rule. And it was never intended to set up idolatrous worship, but to be a symbol of civil power, and that no evil was intended can be noted from the subduing of Midian in verse 28, and the quietness of wars, and the fact that idolatry came after Gideon's death, as verse 33 shows, as well as the commendation of Gideon in verse 35. And the weight of the gold was approximately 42 pounds. So if you were in the military, you were in the army, you probably remember ruck marching with the big bag on your back, and that's about 35 pounds. So that is the approximate weight of this gold. And the people, they were happy to give, but it was inappropriate as it lifted Gideon above the people's level at their expense. And it sounds very common with what we see today that I'll talk about in the wrap-up. In verse 27 it says, Then Gideon made it into an ephod, and he set it up in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon into his house. So as spoken of back in Exodus 28, an ephod was a shirt-like garment worn by the priest of Israel. And obviously Gideon was wrong, and immediately it's unclear why he did this. And the people of Israel enjoyed the idolatrous worship. And the beautiful and the expensive ephod became a snare to Gideon and his family and all of Israel. In verse 28 through 31 says, Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so they lifted up their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine was with in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. So Gideon's rule as a judge over Israel was a success. Yet in many ways, we see that he was a spiritual failure. We see that he's fallen into the sin of polygamy severely against what God has given as a blueprint, as God has defined marriage between a man and a woman, one-on-one. And polygamy at this time, you're going to see throughout the Old Testament, was very highly tolerated among many. And Abimelech was a son of another unlawful relationship that we're going to see in the next video on Saturday, as he grew up to be a wretched king. And polygamy always results in trouble. Polygamy in the Bible has never done anything positive. In verse 32 says, Now Gideon the son of Joash died at a good old age, and he was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abizarites. So Abimelech, his name means my father and my king. And throughout Gideon's life, we see a man who slipped from the great heights of faith to outright apostasy and rebellion against God's success and riches and prominence that brought him down. In verse 33 through 35 wraps up the chapter here. Says, so it was as soon as Gideon was dead that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good that he had done for Israel. So we see that Israel served in the memory of Gideon well, as they rebel and they make a covenant with the false god Baal as their god. And Baal Berith means Baal of the covenant. So to wrap up the chapter, we see that Gideon, he battled the Midianite kings and the contentious Israelites. And we saw Ephraim's complaint and Gideon's answer. We see the sins of Sukkoth and Penuel. We saw that Gideon repaid Sukkoth and Penuel, and we saw that Gideon refused to be made as king, as Israel was under him as a judge. He didn't seek to be a king, even though the people wanted him to be their king. And we saw through that Gideon gathered a fortune, and it lifted him far above the level as those who gave to him in contribution. And it's kind of like some preachers today on certain television and radio programs that are living their best lives now. They're living millions of dollars, hoarding, living in multiple mansions and having their own private jets and having, just tons of stuff, and they beg people to go to the phone, 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 and so on with all that nonsense. So some preachers today make their living from the gifts of God's people, and they live like the millionaires while those under them are eating processed foods such as ramen noodles because they can barely afford to take care of their families. And they don't know if they'll have enough to cover rent. But we saw that Gideon used these riches that he received, and assumed an appropriate role of religious leadership and led Israel into idolatry. And, to me, with the prosperity gospel, that's really what it's doing, is it's leading people into idolatry, that they're seeking after the riches instead of seeking after the kingdom of God and the things of God. And we saw that Gideon assumed a polygamy lifestyle. In the Old Testament, one of the biggest critics that you're going to find about the Old Testament is that it never condemns polygamy directly. But it also shows, though, that the bitter fruit of polygamy, we can see the result of the sin. And you can see that in Jacob and David's and the conflicts and crises that arose because of polygamous behavior. And Jesus reassured that God has only one definition of what he has instituted as marriage, being between as one man, one woman. And Jesus spoke about that in Matthew chapter 19, verse 4 through 6. And we saw that Gideon assumed, or he hoped for, a hereditary move. And after Gideon, we saw Israel rebelling, and they make a covenant with Baal. And that's going to wrap up this video today. We'll see you Saturday, as we're going to look at Abimelech. We're going to see how he rose and how he falls. And that will be the end of today. I hope you have a great rest of your week and a great weekend up ahead. God bless.